who am I? Am I a black man who happens to live in America? Or am I an American who happens to be black?
He was a brilliant man, brilliant thinker.
He was second only to Martin Luther King.
He knew exactly what to say, and he didn't care who liked it or didn't like it.
He had a better relationship with Johnson than anybody did. The Kennedys didn't like him because he was so militant.
He worked very easily with Martin Luther King. He also had a very strong friendship with Malcolm X.
This man sacrificed family relationships.
Things that daddies do, they just didn't have the time to do them.
He was being their father by going to jail, by leading marches, by sitting on buses. He was being their father so that their children would not have to endure that.
Torturous ride into the conscience of America. We stirred the indignation of the American people. You know, even people who weren't on our side were appalled.
I believe President Obama even recognizes that he is where he is because of the sacrifices of James Farmer.
I was walking around Sproul Plaza, which is where they had the demonstrations, and there was a big crowd, and I stopped to listen. A man stood up and kind of emerged from the crowd. He projected his voice extraordinarily well. His phrasing was brilliant, and what he spoke was just absolutely captivating.
Fellow freedom fighters, white, black, brown, you have been in the streets marching. The staccato march of your feet, punctuated by the clanging of jail cell doors, have set the stage for this revolution.
As a result, James Farmer Jr. really stuck with me the rest of my life. In the early 90s, I started to become a freelance writer, and I came across this literally 3-page article that was about this college, a tiny college in the Jim Crow South, was among the first, if not the first, to debate white colleges. And then I kept reading, and I discovered that on the team was James Farmer Jr. I said to myself, I'm a white liberal intellectual. Why don't I know this story? Which then led to the larger question, why doesn't America know this story? But when I put down that article, I thought, this has got to be a movie.
It was such a saga of people that had been oppressed, not only becoming exceptional in their field, but being the first to debate white colleges in the Deep South, and then to discover the self-doubts and the self-hatreds that were engendered by living in such a segregated society.
The very fact that we have a man that has so much courage that he was willing to risk his life for this movement always makes me feel a certain reverence. He went through a war, and he came out a hero.
I thought it was a great film. I really did. Mother Farmer, I think, was portrayed absolutely the way she was. She just did not like any kind of controversy. She didn't want any kind of disturbance. She wanted peace. It was not nice to be an agitator.
I'll speak.
Forrest Whitaker was just too big a guy to play Father Farmer, who was a small man.
I put away all childish things.
Father Farmer and I had a great relationship. I would go over and sit at the table with him, and we would just chat.
James Farmer Sr. was able to go to a northern white university to get a PhD. But the problem was, these African Americans could be brilliant men with PhDs from Boston University or even Harvard, but they couldn't teach anywhere except in segregated colleges because they couldn't get hired.
The scene when his father is driving to a family picnic with the entire family in the car, and they hit a pig.
What was that?
Father Farmer said he had to pay the man his money. And he said it was just humiliating, absolutely humiliating, but he had to save his family, his kids.
I can only imagine how that crafted the way he felt about his father, the way he felt about being black. You know, there's a little possibility of self-hate, how he felt about white people, how he felt about this person who obviously was not his father's intellectual equal.
In the early 80s, Bill Moyers came back to his hometown to film Marshall, Texas, called that because when he was growing up, there was a white marshal and a black marshal, and they rarely met. And he had brought another Marshallite, James Farmer, to tell that story.
What was it like in Black Marshall in those days?
It was a small town, and the two worlds had such little contact. There was an etiquette. The fact that black was not to be called Mr., because that would sort of symbolize an equality. That was another world, and a world which we knew existed, but thought about as little as we could. It was painful to think of the fact that we were told, you're not good enough to associate with other people. I would go downtown to see a movie in the movie house. I think it was the Paramount Theater in those days. Blacks sat up in the balcony, so when we walked downtown, we would go around to the side entrance and up those stairs and see the movie. And we would sit there, front row center, balcony, of course, watching Tarzan as he would swing through the trees by the vines, you know. They would show the Africans dancing around the pot to the tom-tom beat, you know. Dum, 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 dum. Then I'd elbow my buddy, hey, Irving, that's you. I don't have to tell you what Irving's reaction was. It was, no, man, that's on me. I'm no African. Don't call me an African. I'm an American. Well, Irving was rejecting Africa and rejecting self, and that was true of then 10, 13 million black Irvings. We would tell ourselves and each other how horrible segregation was and that something must be done about it. But that didn't go very deep, because the very next afternoon, we would walk down to the Paramount Theater, go around to the side entrance, and sit in the buzzard's roost.
Did anybody tell you this is wrong, this is an affront to humanity?
Of course. We had one professor, Professor Melvin B. Tolson, who was a professor of English, coach of debate, and well-known black poet. Well, in his classes, he taught everything. He compelled people to think.
If Farmer had inspiration, part of it, of course, was his father, but the other was Tolson. Not only did he teach them to think, but he showed them that the status quo was not acceptable.
Well, at the time, in the 30s, debate was really a spectator sport. It did attract huge crowds. It did get a lot of support, and it really was a really central part of collegiate life at historically black colleges.
When we understand who Farmer was, we need to understand that he was a person built about processing information and doing really vigorous research. You couldn't be successful in the 1930s. You can't be successful today unless you're an outstanding researcher. He worked feverishly. He was an avid reader, no doubt inspired by his father. He would scribble notes upon notes on legal pads and write and rewrite his arguments and move things around and rearrange and find new facts and figures and examples that he could use. He could organize the thoughts in his mind, keep track of them, and then stand and deliver to the audience. Most of all, he relished the opportunity to go head-to-head and compete.
Tolson was interested in Gandhi, and he was teaching them that this is a unique possibility of social change. And I think that being drawn to that, where there is more of a sense that we will change the world, we will not just accommodate ourselves to this world, but we will change it. I think Tolson had a different voice than his father.
They may be fools, but they're smart businessmen. And once we're organized, they'll see even guns can't stop us.
It made Farmer realize that intellectual triumph wasn't enough, that he had to do organization as well.
Did you decide here at Wiley College to challenge the system?
Yes, there's no question about it. I decided it out of my contact with Professor Tolson and the conflict within my own soul. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which I founded in 1942, was stimulated to a great extent by that contradiction which I felt while I was here at Wiley.
My heart and my soul waiting you to take us home.
Jim was going to be a Methodist minister, like his father, but the year that he was to be ordained, the Methodist Church, North and South, reunited, but only if the black Methodists were peeled off in a segregated conference, and he said he wouldn't do that.
And so his father said, asked him, well, what are you going to do then, Jim, if you're not going to go into the ministry? You know, this is what he was trained for. So all PKs or preachers of kids have been trained for. He says he planned in segregation. That's an ambitious kind of mission to undertake. That's almost like you're asking to say you're going to create the world in 6 days. You know?
So he had the training of a minister and the understanding of the Methodist social gospel that said, you change the world where you are. And that's what he did.
Segregation in places of public accommodation was not a Southern phenomenon, but was a national phenomenon, existing throughout the country. Frequently, one would see a black walk by a restaurant and slow his or her pace and look in and continue walking. It was the uncertainty, the not knowing in the northern cities then where one could go and could not go. In the South, there was no question, no doubt. Couldn't go anyplace. Well, that began to change. Students at the University of Chicago in April, I think it was, of 1942.
You and Jim Farmer went out in the neighborhood to get a cup of coffee to a place called Jack Sprat's.
Right. We weren't looking for trouble, we were looking for coffee. The manager walked over to me and said, we can't serve you, you'll have to get out of here. And I looked up with genuine surprise.
They wouldn't take the money, so we left the money on the counter.
The manager rushed to the door behind us, hurled the money out into the street, screaming, take your money and get out, we don't want it. This was Chicago, not Chattanooga. Jim and I discussed it and decided that we owed it to this gentleman's religion to return to his place of business. A few days later, we went back in a party of 6, 3 white and 3 black.
We didn't have a huge group, but we had enough to occupy all of the space, the counter space.
Right.
Now, I remember the woman came out and she said, you can sit here till midnight, but you will not be served. She then called the police. The police have sometimes not been very friendly, but on this occasion, I must say they acted pretty well, and we were served. That was one of our victories.
Maybe a year after the formation of CORE, Farmer met Lula, who was a white pacifist, and they developed a friendship which blossomed into a marriage.
She was his partner in every way. She did his travel, she did his bookkeeping, she did his mending, and she was his mainstay at home, his wife, his lover, she was his everything. Actually, Lula may have been more intellectual than Jim. And the reason I said it is that she would get the books, read them, tell Jim about them, and then Jim would go and talk about it like he'd read it. That was part of his gift, and that was her gift to him. Lula had Hodgkin's disease, and there was sometimes when she would be really quite ill, and other times she'd be fine. The doctors told her not to have children because it might create a flare in the Hodgkin's disease. And of course, she apparently got pregnant, but I know that Lula was concerned because apparently the doctor had advised her to have an abortion. But she did have Tammy, and she was perfectly fine. And I remember her telling me once, she said, suppose I had not had this child, look what I would have missed, you know. About 2 years later, she had Abby, and she got through that very well. She may have had a little bit of a flare, but for the most part, she was fine.
We are here for what is ours, what we deserve, and what is rightly American. We are American, and we will be treated as American.
This was a period of anger. People were just basically tired of being abused and misused. Continuous humiliation on a day-to-day basis. And this was the overt discrimination that embarrassed African American every single day of their lives.
Well, the mission of CORE was very clearly stated, nonviolent direct action to bring about freedom now. That was our slogan. I was on what it was called the policy board of CORE, and Dr. Farmer was the executive director.
And he was a guy who you could sit with and have a disagreement with.
He was someone who did not believe in top-down leadership, a natural collaborator. So he didn't have problems reaching out to people with whom he disagreed, absolutely not.
The whites were manifesting as much of a commitment as we were. So how could you do less as an African American? I mean, this really was a strong motivation for me to work even harder.
Increasingly, it was clear that we were talking about power. And so if you're talking power, you're talking numbers, you're talking influence, you're talking what it takes to move things. And so we were clearly not interested in turning anybody away.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around.
There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry, or religion, or race, or color.
The United States Supreme Court had rendered a decision finding that racial segregation is discrimination and unconstitutional. 14 years later, the Supreme Court found that racial segregation in the use of bus terminal facilities was unconstitutional. Yet, nothing happened.
Those Supreme Court decisions had become merely scraps of paper, gathering dust, cobwebs over them. They were not being enforced.
On the buses, blacks sat in the back. And at the bus terminals, the waiting rooms were segregated. The water fountains were labeled color, white water and colored water. And that pattern existed even after the Supreme Court decision in Boynton.
On May 4th, 1961, 13 of us, Negroes and whites, bought tickets in Washington, D.C. for a long ride through the Deep South. I'm James Farmer, National Director of the Congress of Racial Equality, more often known as CORE. We were called a variety of things. We were the Freedom Riders.
This was not civil disobedience, really, because we would be doing merely what the Supreme Court said we had a right to do. And we felt that we could then count upon the racists of the South to create a crisis so that the federal government would be compelled to enforce federal law.
CORE chapters all over the country were involved with some pretty dramatic direct action techniques. And sometimes it got a bit scary and difficult.
Direct action is a way of confronting someone to be violent. It's far more powerful to be nonviolent in a situation where other people are being violent, quite frankly. As the leader of CORE, he could do no less than to give an example of what it means to conform to a nonviolent discipline.
And CORE grew up with this philosophy that you don't hate your enemy. You love him, but you hate the deed. If you don't believe it's a philosophy, it's a technique and a strategy that we use because we're outnumbered.
In our chapter, we had nonviolent training sessions in order to make sure they were ready to be involved in a nonviolent demonstration. it was crucial that we maintain the discipline of the picket line.
About half the group played the role of freedom riders. The other half played the role of white hoodlums coming in to beat them up. And they were pretty realistic, too. And we reversed roles and played the scene over. At the end of that week, I honestly felt that every member of that group was ready for anything, including death.
All the training they had could not have prepared them for what they experienced. It was hard to get prepared for that.
I went to visit my father, who was terminally ill of cancer, and I told him what I was about to do, told him of the Freedom Ride. He put on his reading glasses and said, well, son, I wish you wouldn't go, but I know you will. And I pray that you survive it. We shook hands and hugged, and I left.
Our ride, supposed to be only 13 days long, was designed to push Jim Crow off his perch. Alabama's Governor Patterson believed we had a different purpose.
They're buying tickets from town to town and getting off in each town and seeking through mixed groups, Negro men and white women, to force themselves into situations which tend to inflame the local people. That's what they are doing.
Despite what the governor said, there was no violence in Virginia or North Carolina.
The first violence occurred in Rock Hill, South Carolina. John Lewis walked toward the segregated white waiting room in the terminal.
And there were two young whites. One of them said, "Get to the other side, boy, where the niggers go." And both of them started stomping and kicking him. Next morning, about 3 o'clock, I got a phone call from home. My mother called to tell me that my father had died, and I must return to Washington and bury him. My mother believed that my father had willed the timing of his death so as to bring me home from the Freedom Ride before that crucial trip across Alabama.
First his father, then his mother, then his brother, and his sister. And I watched him through all of this, and he just seemed not to be able to cope. He would absent himself, and we just assumed he couldn't handle it. Most of us knew. You know, we just sort of understood that this was a quirk of his personality. He just couldn't handle it, and we all forgave it.
Sunday morning, Mother's Day.
Oh, freedom.
When we rolled into the terminal in Anniston, mobs of men were waiting for us. When the bus finally pulled out of the terminal, the mob followed us.
Members of the mob had slashed the tires of the bus, held the door shut, and threw a firebomb through a window. The bus filled with smoke and burst into flames.
And before I'll be asleep.
The picture, the photograph of that burning Greyhound bus was, I think, on the front page of every newspaper in the world.
We'll take hitting, we'll take beating. We're willing to accept death. But we're going to keep coming until we can ride from anywhere in the South to any place else in the South.
Torturous ride into the conscience of America. We stirred the indignation of the American people. You know, even people who weren't on our side were appalled when they saw the atrocities that were being rendered against helpless people.
I mean, that just showed the depth of the feeling, the hatred and the violence, and it surely exposed that we had a serious problem on our hands. African Americans already knew that, the rest of the country did not.
These 13 Freedom Riders could not go on. They had been chewed up too badly. I got a call then from Diane Nash, one of the unsung heroines of the movement. She said, "Jim, would you object if I send in some young SNCC students to pick up that freedom ride in Birmingham?" I said, "Diane, it may be suicide." She said, "Of course we realize that, but we can't let them stop you with violence. If we do, the movement is dead."
I think one of the things that was remarkable about that period was the collaboration and the cooperation. Yes, there were distinct roles, just as there would be distinct roles in a military operation, but you need them all.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
The SNCC people went into Birmingham and they were chased by the Klan. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of white men rioting in the streets, beating up any black they find.
After the funeral of my father in Washington, I flew to Montgomery. A rally had been planned at Ralph Abernathy's church.
As we approached the church, we were blocked by the mob. We got through the graveyard. Kennedy asked King to try to persuade me to halt the freedom ride and have a cooling off period. This was war. It was like war. It was war, but nonviolent war on our part. Halt the freedom ride and have a cooling off period. The answer was, I regret that I cannot comply with the request. We've been cooling off for 350 years. If we cool off any more, we'll be in a deep freeze. The freedom ride must go on.
Do you want your freedom?
It wasn't his natural bent to be confrontational, but when he had to be, at the right time, he knew exactly what to say, and he didn't care who liked it or didn't like it.
I was scared. They were scared too, but I saw something besides fear in their eyes. I saw a fierce determination to do what they thought had to be done, and I gained courage from them.
The freedom rides tried to add some new elements to the movement by having people stay in jail in order to place as heavy a burden as possible upon the oppressing power of the state. The slogan became jail, not bail.
All these people were engaged in activities for the benefit of people, to fight the good fight.
Nonviolence was well known throughout the country and was being proclaimed as the new mood of the black community. That is only partly true. The black community was never monolithic. There were threads of violence.
We declare our right on this earth to be a human being, to be given the rights of a human being, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
And many persons were curious at the name X. The Nation of Islam members insisted that black Americans did not know what their names were. The names which most black Americans bear were the names of their slave masters. Now, he stood in stark contrast to Martin Luther King. King was a preacher's son, a PK. Malcolm was a preacher's son, but he was a preacher's son who had been schooled in hate. Malcolm had been to jail, served time in prison, dealt in prostitution and drugs. He was feared as a debater, and he really packed them in. They would shout their approval. I could handle Malcolm. I wasn't afraid of him. My strategy was to make Malcolm speech for him. I had studied his speeches, and he was devastating on the attack. Malcolm was at his weakest when he was providing a solution. So what I did was to make his speech, tell of the crimes that had been committed, and then say, this is what we do about the situation now, and then go through CORE's program.
revolutionary struggle is a part of a historical process. And certainly the Negro American was bound to come to the point where he asked, what about these tenets of democracy? Don't they apply to me? And if not now, when? Negroes are saying, not tomorrow, not next week, but now.
Let the black man, those of our people in this country who want to, have a country of our own where we can go and stand on our own feet and solve our own problems and not have to continue going to court or waiting for some politician to legislate for another 100 or 2 years to prove that we're human beings.
After seeing Mississippi and Alabama close up, I'd be glad to give him those states if it were within my power to do so.
The mistake that is made by many of our people is they always make a distinction between North and South. The only difference is the black man in the South knows where it is, and the black man in the North is being tricked every day by white liberals who grin in his face and pretend to be his friend, but at the same time is practicing segregation just as much as the white man in the South is practicing it.
Well, I would expect that it will take several years longer in the North for us to wipe out the more subtle forms of discrimination in housing, in employment, in de facto school segregation, and of police brutality. I think, however, that within 5 or 10 years at the most, I'll be able to take a vacation and go fishing.
Malcolm was over at my home just 2 months before he was killed. He said, "Brother James, I was not lucky as you were. I had very little formal education, only grade school education. Consequently, I believed everything the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had told us.
And he has reached the conclusion that anyone who will fight with us is my brother."
He died before he completed that thought process.
Malcolm X was assassinated and became much more of a leader after his death than before. Martin Luther King is assassinated when he is at the top of his influence. But Farmer lived until he was nearly 80. People forgot about the civil rights movement, and they forgot about him.
Now to the march itself. The originator of the march was a man by the name of A. Philip Randolph, elder statesman of the movement. He proposed a gigantic march on Washington involving black and white, and to demand passage of civil rights legislation, to protest discrimination. I was arrested in Plaquemine while the march was being planned. I was urged to come out, to bail out of jail and come to the march and make a speech on behalf of CORE. Well, I did a lot of soul searching, then decided that I could not do so in good conscience.
His staff begged him to leave because they knew that this March on Washington was going to be a big deal. And he was really frightened that if he left, the people who were in jail with him would be brutalized.
I watched the March on Washington on television, however. There were at least 400,000 persons there. I watched it and I was impressed. I wept during some of the speeches. And I wished, of course, that I'd been there.
He was the guy who all of the anger and violence was more or less focused at, but he never hesitated to get back on a bus and go into one of those pits.
Jim was seen as just someone who was really a troublemaker. There was a strong feeling among the Southern Ku Klux Klan, this one we have to get. And I think that speaks to the impact and the power they knew he had, you know, because they figured if they got him, then they could slow this stuff down.
We have many weapons. One great weapon is our own bodies as we march and we picket and we sit in all over the country. You have power. You have found that power.
local citizens, black citizens of this town, held a march to protest police brutality. The march was stopped when it got to the edge of town. State police, state troopers mounted the horses and rode into the crowd of marchers. Wielding electric cattle prods, the would-be marchers came running back to the church in disarray. And the troopers hurled tear gas canisters into the crowd of people. We could hear shouts out in the street, yelling, "Come on out, farmer! We know you're in there!" Honestly, I did not expect to live through the night. I did not expect to live through the next hour. Two of the men grabbed me. One of them said, "If you go out there tonight, you won't be alive tomorrow morning." I said, "That's a lynch mob, baby." So they decided to use not one hearse, but two hearses. High speed on dirt and gravel roads, and back way to New Orleans. We, at my home, began to get threatening phone calls then. All through the night, when I was out of town. "Your husband's not home yet, is he?" "No." "That's right, you see, he's going to be a little delayed. In fact, he won't get home. He's been called away to a funeral, his own." She said, "Oh, thank you very much." I said, "What?" She said, "Thank you. You just remind me to pay last month's life insurance policy." Next call, say, "We're going to kill your two little girls." Well, Lula was pretty cool through most of these calls, up until the time they threatened the girls.
I think the children felt a lot of the anxiety that Lula felt. She couldn't shield them. They were always exposed.
Jim would be gone, as you can imagine, for long periods of time, even when he wasn't in jail. And she had to keep the home fires burning.
Oh, she was the super mom. She did everything for the children. They missed nothing. Abby, she just would not talk, and it was after she had seen her father being arrested on television. That's what her mother said. And then she just disappeared into a corner somewhere, stayed for days.
Dearest Lula, tell Tammy that Daddy is in jail for her sake, for he loves her, and I love you, Jim.
Things that daddies do, they just didn't have, the time to do them. And he always regretted that.
The search for identity was a positive force, but along with it came a hatred of whites. That conflict began to develop in the civil rights movement and split the civil rights movement down the middle.
All men are born free. That is to say, white America is denying us our freedom.
Stokely Carmichael made a speech. He had made that speech a number of times before, and it had not created a ripple. This time it was different. Stokely said, "When anybody asks you what you want, it's not freedom now. What is freedom now? The thing that makes this country go round is power. So what you want is power. Black power. Black power."
The revolution has come. It's time to pick up the gun. The revolution has come.
It was clear that nonviolence as a tactic was losing ground because of the massive violence that we had encountered. Not only Malcolm X was saying this, but some of the CORE and SNCC activists were saying it.
CORE was becoming more and more segregated to the point that they were pushing out their white members. Farmer was a consummate integrationist, and he wanted no part of that, and so he resigned from CORE.
It wasn't the CORE we knew, it wasn't the CORE we wanted to be involved with at that point in our lives, and so we just pulled away. Roy Innes took leadership, and Roy had a very different philosophy, a different style.
CORE became more and more black nationalist to the point that Farmer wanted no part of it, and by the time of his death, he didn't even want to be associated with CORE.
Jim was not a bitter person. I think he had some real regrets that it had moved in a direction that was so different from the one that he had envisioned and had dedicated his much of his life to.
Gentlemen, we've survived. Alan Morrison is gone, and Malcolm X was assassinated not all that much after our program together, a couple of years, but long enough for him seemingly to have shifted his own orientation.
Malcolm moved closer toward the civil rights movement after his return from Mecca.
Absolutely.
And he was convinced then that racism, as he had witnessed it in America, was learned and not genetic.
I remember the morning that I stood by the Washington Monument on the Great March in '63. And I really believe with all my heart that the beloved community was just around the corner, 7 or 8 years away. And now here, 30-some years later or more, I know I will not see it in my lifetime, even if I live to be 100 years old.
We were fighting against Jim Crow, against segregation, and not against racism, unfortunately, and we may have confused the two. We thought that by knocking down the for colored and for white signs, we would solve the race problem. I do want to emphasize that we made some changes. We did wipe out Jim Crow. We just overestimated the impact that would have on changing the life condition of the black American.
Nearly 30 years ago, you said you thought it would take maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, and you could go fishing. When I remind you of that, you
Well, Wyatt is right. I'll go fishing in the next life now.
He was tired. Jim Farmer had 2 daughters and a wife who was ill, and he needed to tend to home. And I think he was also exhausted because he had been selfless all this period.
Jim was a guy who had pretty much of a total commitment to this thing and paid a big price for it.
He just needed to do something to shore up his own personal life. When he was given the opportunity to join the administration at HEW, then Health, Education, and Welfare, as Assistant Secretary for Administration, it seemed an odd fit. Jim was also pretty pragmatic. I think he felt there was a window of opportunity.
He called me up and asked me what I thought about it. And as I recall, I took a bottle of Jack Daniels and went over to his house. And that time, we both were imbibing. We didn't know we were on our way to diabetes. At that time, HEW had 100,000 employees. I said, you change one line of a personnel policy. I said, you impact the lives of tens of thousands of people. So he took the job. A week or two later, I got a telephone call from Washington. And it was Jim on the phone asking me to come down and join him as his special assistant. I said, oh, you're out of your mind. I work for Nixon. I guess like many people, I just didn't trust Nixon. I was always the cynic. Just about anybody that wanted to see him could. All of a sudden, they had a friend, as it were, inside the big house. And HEW began to look a little bit different inside and out. There was a milk company in Brooklyn that had about a little less than 1,300 employees. Only 5 of them who looked like me.
I think that it's in the interest of the nation now to adopt a policy of compensatory treatment because of the discrimination of 100 years, discrimination in education, in training, and in employment. Otherwise, we will not break this vicious cycle. Now, we've been receiving special treatment for 300 to 400 years here. We've been receiving special treatment of a negative nature. Now we're asking for the kind of special treatment that is positive and affirmative.
Subsequently, Jim met with then Vice President Johnson. I called it compensatory preferential minority recruitment and placement and advancement. And, you know, I'm just a wordsmith, Jim used to say. If there's one word could be used, you'll use 20. And Johnson's reaction to this statement, he says, no, that's political suicide. There's got to be something more positive, more affirmative. He says, that's it. And then that's affirmative action began. He used an analogy I thought was really very striking. He says, how you can ask two men to join in a race when one has been in shackles? And then many people began to understand that the race wasn't even. And on the other hand, we've always had affirmative action. The only problem has been for white males. The handicaps that have been placed on minorities and women had to be removed if we were going to be a just society. I'd always been proud of that. I said, tens of thousands of people, maybe more, have gotten employment because of that idea. It lasted about a year and a half, a little less than that maybe. Jim wasn't really cut out to be a man behind the desk. He wanted to be, whether the action was or talking to people, meeting people, challenging the status quo. It was hard to do that from his vantage point.
Gentlemen, I have asked you to come here today so that I may announce my resignation. I came here hoping that a black activist could work within government to help change the quality of our lives in the 70s. I was wrong, terribly, finally wrong.
When I learned that Lula had been in the hospital for a week or two, I came up and I spent each day with her. You know, I'm caretaking, I'm really caretaking at this point. I think she was just struggling to stay alive. I think maybe 3 days after I left, she died. So I was not there for her, and she died. As kind and as wonderful as he was just not much of a nurturer.
Dr. Farmer was not this definition of a deadbeat dad, but it was a sacrifice that he made. They had to sacrifice not knowing Daddy. He sacrificed those relationships, family relationships, to help other children. He was being their father by going to jail, by leading marches, by sitting on buses. He was being their father so that their children would not have to endure that. But I am sure that he went to his grave with the guilt, perhaps, or even with the pain that I wish I had been there, or I wish I had done more. Enjoy the freedom and the blessing to be able to spend time with my own children because someone else sacrificed time with their children.
A year after the filming of Marshall, Texas, I got a phone call from Bill Moyers, and he said, Farmer does not know where his next meal is coming from. Lula had died. He had 2 teenage girls that he had very little relationship with, and he had no job. The job at Mary Washington came through when he needed it most.
In 1982, I was commuting by bus, and also commuting back and forth on the bus was this big, fine-looking African-American fellow with a wonderful voice. I said, "Are you by any chance William Moorfield, who starred in the movie Showboat?" He said, "No, I'm James Farmer." So we struck up an acquaintance. He put together the first big lecture about civil rights history for us and for the university, and talked about the hoses and the dogs. And afterward, as I was walking away, and I heard one student say to another, "Do you think that ever really happened in this Christian country?" I thought, whoa, we got some learning and teaching to do.
I think he found and saw someone that was a distinguished civil rights leader, a natural-born leader, and someone that would inspire young people. And that's exactly what he did for the almost 15 years that he taught here. Became easily the most well-attended and most famous course in the college curriculum, and he was the most famous professor.
He loved teaching that class, and it was a difficult class to get in. I mean, it was in like an auditorium, and it was packed every semester. Sometimes I would watch him and say, this man is blind, and he's lecturing, which means all the information is up here.
One of the reasons that I study history is because I think there are lessons that we can learn from history so that our lives are a little bit better. I'm curious, what lessons do you take from James Farmer's life?
I feel like he probably felt that he accomplished a lot, but the excitement of the civil rights movement had died down a bit. There was less attention, less energy for the cause.
If Dr. Farmer had delivered his speech and he didn't have someone else do it, do you think he would have been, people would know his name better?
Would he have catapulted past Martin Luther King?
Maybe. We'll never know.
I think our history books in high school kind of sugarcoat the civil rights movement, whereas James Farmer's book really gets into the nitty-gritty, and it's more of like the reality of the situation.
Like when we were learning about the civil rights movement, everything was kind of abbreviated. Like they just put out the main points that we need to know, and then like stop from there.
What was the number one main point?
Probably Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther
King.
King.
They definitely put him as like the top of like the only civil rights activist during the civil rights movement.
Because he had this opportunity at Mary Washington to reach out to young people, it kept him going.
And I think he really started to deteriorate was when he had that last stroke, because it affected his memory. I started learning about diabetes when I was dealing with Dr. Farmer, because I needed to know what he didn't need. And sometimes, you know, you saw this man who was blind and his kidney's not working, he's had a stroke, he's had a heart attack. Sometimes you just felt, well, maybe he deserves to have this second bowl of ice cream. I was down there one day and I saw this beautiful girl and I asked who she was, and he said, that's my daughter. I said, you got a daughter that lives down here? He said, yes. He just gave me short answers. And that was enough for me to know, leave that subject alone.
Well, initially he was there by himself because he just had the one amputation. And I mean, I wouldn't say his health was good, but you know, he thought he was going to get his prosthetic leg and be able to go up and down the stairs and use the pool and, you know, do things. After a while, you lose the strength in your upper body. So being able to maneuver, and I think it was just not something he was going to be able to do. And then when he lost the other leg, and plus being totally blind, I mean, he needed help all the time. I mean, I know I got really close to him just after he got sick, just because I was right here. There were times that I drove over here 3 times a day to either medicines and make sure he had the right food. It was really depressing for him to not be able to see, not be able to get up and do things. He was not used to having people do things for him.
Dr. Farmer was in the hospital, and he told me he wanted some ice cream.
I said, Jim, is there anything you wish you could have done or could have been like? He said, I wished I could have been like Paul Robeson, could sing like Paul Robeson.
Sadly one Sunday I waited and waited,
And then he proceeded to sing, "What Side Are You On?" And I said, well, you can't have everything.
So around 2:30, I get a call that he had passed. I was devastated because I said all he wanted was a cup of ice cream. But he did tell me when I was leaving, he said, "Sloan, I'm tired." And I really didn't pick up on that.
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boys?
When Lula died, he had her cremated and took her ashes and left them in his library. And I was thinking, well, this is a memorial service for Lula as well. He was who he was because of who she was.
I think he knew that he had made a contribution and that it was a sacrificial contribution. And the human side of him said, you know, I wish somebody would recognize that.
He always resented the fact that King got so much notoriety, if you will, in the positive sense, when he felt that he had really been the father of the nonviolent movement in America.
I asked him once how he felt about that, and he said, well, I guess I have to be a martyr to get that. And I said, yes, but then consider that alternative. The alternative is to stay alive as long as you can and to keep doing what you're doing. That's why I pushed so hard to help him get the Presidential Medal of Freedom, because he deserved it.
He had been on this battleground since 1942. And that's a long time to be out there in the fields, trying to make things right for everybody.
I believe President Obama even recognizes that he is where he is because of the sacrifices of James Farmer, of Emmett Till, of Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Malcolm X, so many others. And I believe there are a whole lot of civil rights soldiers who are singing in heaven, say my living has not been in vain.